Hi, this is Brad Keithley, Managing Director of Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets. Welcome to the weekly top three, the top three things on our mind here at Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets for the week of February 10th, 2025. The weekly top three is a regular segment on The Michael Dukes Show. The show broadcasts on both Facebook Live and YouTube Live, as well as via streaming audio from the show's website, weekdays from 6 to 8 a.m. I join Michael weekly in the first hour of Tuesday's show from 6:10 to 7 a.m. for a discussion between the two of us about our three issues. We post the podcast of our discussion following the show on the Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets Facebook, YouTube, SoundCloud, Spotify, and Substack pages, also on the Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets website, as well as the project's page on national blog site, medium.com. You can find past episodes of the weekly top three also at the same locations. Keep in mind that in addition to these podcasts, during the week, you can also follow and participate in the discussion with us of these and other issues affecting Alaska's fiscal and economic condition by following us on the Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets Facebook page and through our posts on Twitter. This week, our top three issues are these. First, we explain what a difference a week makes as we sort through recent developments on the Cook Inlet import projects. Second, our thoughts on President Trump's comments on Japan and AKLNG. And third, we discuss the additional disclosure that we think all presentations and op-eds pushing for more state appropriations should contain. And now, let's join Michael.
This week's topic, let's get started. Sorting out the Cook Inlet. There's a lot here, Brad. Unpack it for us here. What do we got?
So the alternate title to this segment is What a Difference a Week Makes. Last week, we were complaining about the RCA had not stepped up to look into what was going on in the Cook Inlet. We were complaining. We were saying, where is Chugach and MEA in all this? NSTAR was on track to sort of an unabated track to go forward on talk about Quixotic, on its Quixotic effort to build a new LNG plant on property that neither it nor the person who it proposes to build the plant own without any existing permits, but nevertheless was on track to do that. That's all changed in a week, and the reason I'm wearing the ray of sunshine is I think it's changed in a good way. Two big things. One pretty public, the other sort of running under the radar. The one that's pretty public is the announcement during the week by Chugach and Harvest Alaska, which is a subsidiary of Hillcorp, for Hillcorp to buy the old Kenai LNG plant, the existing plant, the plant that's got the existing permits to import gas right now, has got the facilities mostly in place to do that, has got existing LNG tanks in place to store the imported gas, a lot of the imported gas. The announcement by Chugach and Hillcorp that Hillcorp's going to buy that facility from Marathon, and Hillcorp then is going to sell gas that it regasifies out of that plant to Marathon, who, interestingly enough, uses a lot of gas or would like to use a lot of gas to power its refinery, and to sell it to Chugach, and to solve Chugach's problem in that fashion. Where NSTAR talks about 2030, 2029, 2030 as a solution to its problem. Its plant on land neither it nor the party with whom it has entered into a contract own. While NSTAR talks about that time frame, Chugach and Hillcorp are talking about, or Harvest are talking about, a time frame much shorter than that, a time frame that meets Chugach's needs and presumably would meet MEA's needs and Homer's needs.
Like next year, you're talking about like 2026 by delivering some of the first gas with full production coming up in 28, right? I mean, it's a fast timeline compared to everything else we've heard so far.
Well, it's an existing plant. What you have to do is you have to re-kit it some, because right now it's still kitted to export, gas to take gas in, liquefy it, and then put it and then export it on ships and take it out. So you've got to change that machinery out to regasify the liquefied gas that's going to come in, and you've got to get a permit. Right now, it's FERC permitted only to receive gas for sale to Marathon's needs. It's not permitted for sale to others. But those things, I don't think most analysts think those things are big deals. Certainly not the equipment side of it's not a big deal, and I don't think most analysts think the permit side is a big deal. So that's one thing. That's a huge thing that we'll be talking about now in coming weeks. The second big thing is that the RCA stepped in and put a pause to NSTAR's proposed transaction with Glenfarne. NSTAR had filed for approval, seeking approval to pass the costs of its deal with Glenfarne up to a certain point, sort of the beginning stages of it, up to a certain point through to its ratepayers, without further RCA review. It was essentially an effort to get an approval of its project in the form of a rate increase, without asking the RCA to look at anything else. The RCA stopped that, suspended NSTAR's filing, and set it for hearing to look into it. Now, part of what NSTAR has proposed to do is to, we've talked about the backstop on the AKLNG project a lot, the backstop that ADA has proposed to give to AGDC, so AGDC can give a backstop to Glenfarne. Actually, NSTAR has a backstop in its deal with Glenfarne. It has agreed to fund if NSTAR or Glenfarne has to do the same sort of FID analysis they have to do on the big line, and NSTAR has agreed to backstop Glenfarne's costs on that. If Glenfarne does the FID and decides not to go to FID, or the parties decide not to go to FID, that is, pursue the project, construct the project. If Glenfarne decides not to go to FID, then NSTAR's agreed to backstop Glenfarne, to repay Glenfarne for all the costs it's incurred, up to $50 million. The same thing as on the AGDC side. And NSTAR proposed to the RCA to be able to pass those costs, if it paid those to Glenfarne, pass those costs through to its ratepayers through the gas cost adjustment mechanism. And that'd be a huge sum to try to get through the GCA.
$50 million to the ratepayers just without any further review. Oh, and the RCA said what?
The RCA said stop. Said we're going to have a hearing on this stuff, and it came right before the announcement of the Chugach and Harvest deal, right before it, like the day before it. That the RCA said stop, and I don't think the RCA knew about the Harvest Chugach deal, but the two line up very well. So now what the RCA can do is take that proceeding and turn it into an analysis of what the hell are we doing here in the Cook Inlet? Do we need two facilities? Do we need to keep pursuing this quixotic dream that NSTAR and Glenfarne have to build a project on land neither of them own? To go down the road with this project? Do we need that, or can we collect all of the demand in the Cook Inlet and come through the existing Kenai plant? There is an issue with the existing Kenai plant, and Senator Giesel is actually sort of vacillating between good and bad on this issue. Senator Giesel actually identified it quickly, although she identified it in a very negative way that I don't think it deserves. But the problem is Hilcorp has market power, what lawyers and what antitrust economists would call market power in the Cook Inlet, and it's not hesitated to use that market power. I think what stung Giesel was last year when Giesel proposed to close the Hilcorp loophole, the Hilcorp corporate tax loophole. Hilcorp came back and said, "Oh yeah, you want to do that? Fine. We'll just stop investing in the Cook Inlet." Basically, threatening and blackmailing the legislature over the proposal that Hillcorp pay the same taxes as everybody else. And Giesel, I think, stung by that. As background, Giesel said, there's a problem with this Hillcorp proposal, which is, Hillcorp's market power. They have market power now on the produced gas side. This would give them market power, she's concerned. This would give them market power on the imported gas side, and South Central would just be, totally at Hillcorp's mercy. There's a way of dealing with that, and that is to slightly amend existing utility law in the state to clarify that an LNG import facility that resells gas to utility is in fact a utility itself,
right?
And turn that LNG facility into a utility to the extent it's selling gas to utilities, and that would subject Hillcorp, that plant, to RCA jurisdiction, rate jurisdiction, and terms and conditions of service jurisdiction. I think that'd take care of the problem. But it's an issue that needs to be thought through at the same time as we're thinking through everything else, because you don't want to have the solution to the Hillcorp market power problem be to give Hillcorp another set of market power.
It's interesting because this whole thing also is built around this idea of time compression as a weapon. Has NSTAR been delaying this whole thing long enough to then to go to submit to the RCA? Well, we need this. We need to be able to do this without further review because now we're on a time frame, even though they've been the one that's delaying. There was a post on Facebook last night by somebody who's done a lot of work with HEA talking about HEA, because HEA, Homer Electric Association, is the first utility whose contract is going to run out next month. And they're talking about having to get more gas from NSTAR at triple the cost of what they're getting right now to generate electricity. And if that doesn't make the pucker factor go up for everybody who's on an HEA account, including me, then yeah, you should be looking at this. But I think that's part of the thing, right? Maybe the delay makes sense now. They've been delaying this whole time, Brad, trying to get this thing done so that they could then it's a created crisis at that point, right? But the RCA seems to have called their bluff on it.
Yeah, I think so, Michael. And the RCA really called their bluff on something else. So utilities are supposed to pursue these sorts of options. They're supposed to have adequate service at a reasonable cost. That's part of their statutory obligation. In exchange for the monopoly they're given over their service areas, they're supposed to have adequate service at a reasonable cost. And NSTAR, by this delay, has not only maybe tried to put the RCA in a cram down position with respect to its proposal, but put the RCA in a cram down position with respect to these costs. I mean, if you have a project that doesn't go, a failed project, a utility is not automatically entitled to recover those costs. It's a risk that utilities take. And as the RCA pointed out in its suspension order, it gave NSTAR a healthy rate of return on equity in order to compensate it some for the risk of its supply obligation. What NSTAR is really trying to do with this filing is say, look, we're no risk. If the project goes, great, we can pass through the costs. The project doesn't go, and we incur costs because we have this backstop agreement with Glenfarne. If the project doesn't go, we get to pass those costs through the GCA. And putting the RCA in this time crunch, frankly, I think they're trying to leverage. They were trying to leverage. The time crunch as a way of getting their costs recovered either way when they shouldn't be entitled to that. So the RCA's put a stop to it. Yay for the RCA! Look, we've criticized the RCA a lot. This is a good job, RCA.
Right.
And yay for the Kenai LNG plant for somebody stepping up. Still got an issue to go. Still got the market power issue to go. But somebody stepping up and saying, we're going to use this existing facility.
Yeah, Brad. I mean, I looked at this and all I could think of was, so that was the end game. I mean, literally the light bulb moment went off for me when I looked at this and saw what they were trying to do with this rate increase. And I was like, they've been delaying this whole thing so that they could then backstop it, put time compression in there and say, we don't have time to do this because now we're out of time. And you just got to write the blank check and we'll do it. And thank God the RCA said, whoa, wait a second. we're in charge here. And Chugach, I think, I think that's one of the reasons why Chugach kind of broke faith with them here a while ago and said, no, we're going off in another direction, because I think they could see the way things were going. I mean, this might be some good news.
No, well, the project that NSTAR came up with didn't meet Chugach's needs, didn't meet Chugach's time needs. I mean, NSTAR, it met NSTAR's needs because NSTAR is the last to run out of the Hillcorp contracts. They're last to run out of the Cook Inlet contracts, but it didn't meet Chugach's needs. I mean, Giesel said something that bugged. Well, everything Giesel says bugs me in one way or another.
Hello.
But Giesel said something that just bugs me. She was criticizing Chugach as part of her attack on the Hillcorp market power thing. She was criticizing Chugach for having broken off from NSTAR, having broken off from the unified effort to find a solution to the Cook Inlet. That's not what happened. What happened is NSTAR broke off from Chugach. NSTAR was coming up with a solution. And I think part of the motivation here, Michael, is NSTAR was trying to limit its exposure, right? And you can see that in the filing. NSTAR is saying, look, if they build it, we get to recover the costs. If they don't build it, we get to recover the costs. We don't have to incur any costs. So as part of NSTAR looking out for itself, one perspective on this is it left Chugach high and dry. And Chugach, looking out for itself, said, hey, we need to find another solution. And what about this existing LNG plant over there?
Right.
And so, it is not Chugach breaking off from NSTAR. It's NSTAR breaking off from Chugach and going in a way that helps NSTAR, but not Chugach.
And everybody else too, right? I mean, because this only served them. This didn't serve any of the other utilities, GVEA, MEA, HEA. It didn't help any of the other. This was strictly what was best for NSTAR at that point. And they may say, well, hey, look, we ended up not having to pay. The ratepayers are going to have to pay. So they weren't really even looking out for their own ratepayers at that point. The whole thing is just is astonishing.
I got one comment as I was asking around about the Hillcorp deal or the Harvest deal that I found fascinating. So, why is this Hillcorp buying this as opposed to NSTAR? And the response was, well, only certain people came to the data room to look at buying the plant. The implication was, and I don't know this to be absolutely true, but the implication was NSTAR didn't even go look at the existing plant. They were off in their own world. Again, this entire mindset of NSTAR to not have any risk, to avoid any risk. Because if they would have bought the plant and something would have gone wrong, then they're out the cost of the plant. On the way they're doing this with Glenfarne, they're trying to be riskless. They're trying to just avoid any exposure themselves.
Right. It's astonishing. Two sidebar comments. First of all, Frank asks this every week, and I know it's not really your bailiwick, but do you think Brad will ever address legislative funding for commercial fish? I know it's only tens of millions of dollars, small fish, I guess. That's not really your bailiwick, but have you looked at anything with the fishing or commercial fishing in the state? Is that anything you're working on?
It's not, Michael. I look at it from time to time in the context of the budget and whether it can be a contributor to the budget. But the tax rates you'd have to impose on commercial fish are huge for them to even be a material contributor to the budget. So it's not something I've spent a lot of time on.
Anthony says, I feel bad for Brad sometimes. Being part of Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets has to feel like going to being in the Alaskans for the Domestication of Bigfoots group. Theoretically possible, but realistically never going to happen. Chin up, Brad. And that's what I feel sometimes. It's like we're chasing the inevitable who's-he what's-it that nobody believes in. Brad Keithley, on to number 2 of the weekly top 3. And we're working our way through this stuff. Japan and LNG. This was the big surprise on Friday. I was actually sitting at my desk monitoring my own radio station, listening to this when the president had this press conference. And I was like, what? Alaska LNG as a what? National security? Japan? And I thought, well, we talked about this. We predicted it. Is it really going to come true? Brad, your thoughts on Japan and Alaska LNG and the federal government. What are we looking at here?
So here's what's happening with the LNG project. And it's interesting to see how it's twisting. Dan Sullivan's doing this, and Trump certainly did it on Friday. They're twisting the project from a commercial project, a project that is designed to make a lot of money for whoever builds it, they're twisting, because that hasn't worked out much. I mean, nobody can run numbers. You can't even do fantasy numbers that make that true. They're twisting it into a national security issue and twisting it into, isn't this a great solution to keep Japan tied to Alaska, to the United States? Isn't this a great solution to keep Korea tied? Yeah, they're saying things that are sort of funny. They're saying, oh, we're only an ocean away, or you don't have to go through the Panama Canal. There's no security risks, and LNG is a great way to link into their to provide security to them. At the same time as some of these same people are saying, oh, we wouldn't want Alaska to be dependent on LNG. We wouldn't want to bring LNG up to the because Chinese submarines might take down all of the LNG tankers. But now, LNG tankers in Japan and Korea are secure. But they're twisting the rationalization and the justification for the project into a national security issue. And I think, more power to them. That's if that's how they want to twist it, if that's the real rationalization for the project, then let's go down that road. And if Japan and Korea think that's a rationalization for the project, then let's go down the road. But here's the deal: Alaska shouldn't be paying for it. It's not commercial to Alaska. We don't make money. In fact, we lose money. By the time you look at all the subsidies that the AKLNG that AGDC are assuming that the state would throw in to get the project even down to the cost that they claim would be competitive, Alaska's losing money on this project, clearly losing money on this project. So it's not commercial. Nobody, the new mantra is not a commercial mantra. It's not that you're going to make money out of this project. So it's a thing to do. It's national security. And if it's national security, then the nation ought to pay for it. The federal government ought to pay for it. I mean, nobody would expect Alaska to pay for Coast Guard ships, ice-breaking Coast Guard ships. Although they're most important to Alaska, nobody would expect the state to pay for that national security device. Nobody expects Alaska to pay for the jets up at Eielson that defend us. Nobody expects us to pay for the troops that are up at Wainwright that are prepared to defend the Arctic portion of the U.S., which
not a money making operation,
which is Alaska. Right, they're all national security issues. And so if this now is a national security issue, great, but the feds ought to pay for it. And there's precedent for this. In World War II, we had a problem. The nation perceived a problem getting oil, which was important to the war effort, getting oil from the Gulf Coast to the East Coast. There was concerns about German submarines wiping out the fleet, the tanker fleet that was taking oil from the Southwest, from Texas and Louisiana, which is where the oil was, to the East Coast refineries, primarily in Philadelphia and the New York area. And the concern was that we were putting the nation at risk. And so as a national security event, the federal government built two pipelines. One's called the Big Inch and the other's called the Little Inch. And they're still in operation today. One's in operation as a gas pipeline. The other's in operation as a products pipeline, I think, an oil products pipeline now. But they're still in operation today. And the country built them, created a corporation that had a lot of parts to it, but some of the parts were the oil companies who were capable of building this thing. The country formed a corporation, built the pipelines. It was built as a national asset. As a defense asset, as a national strategic asset. Now, after the war was over and nobody was concerned about German U-boats anymore, they were sold into the private sector as part of the war surplus sales. They were sold into the private sector and became part of the private sector. But at the time they were built, they were perceived as national strategic assets and built as national pipelines. So if that's how we perceive, if that's how we're now perceiving the AKLNG project, if that's the push that Dan Sullivan's putting behind it, then, my response is put your money where your mouth is. If it's a national strategic asset, put it through the defense budget or put it through some other budget to go ahead and build the pipeline, and go forward with it. Go forward with it that way. Don't, just like you wouldn't ask Alaska to pay for the planes up at Eielson or the troops up at Wainwright, or the Coast Guard ships at Kodiak. Don't ask Alaska to pay for it. Don't force the cost of this national strategic asset on one state. Spread it broadly through the federal budget. And I think that's I think that's the way. If we're going to go down this road, I think that's the way to go forward. You can't make a commercial case for this pipeline. You just can't. I mean, AGDC has tried repeatedly to make a commercial case for it. You just can't in the current environment.
Right.
If you look at all of the LNG that's coming on all the Tidewater LNG that's coming on the market throughout the nation, if you look at the forward futures prices for LNG, the AKLNG project just can't compete commercially.
If you look at their own study, which has some of the rosiest assumptions, the Wood-Mackenzie report, which even the rosiest assumptions is an 80% subsidy, and it still delivers gas at 30% above market value. I mean, that's an 80% subsidy on what they're still using numbers from the Walker administration of $44 billion. It's probably 60 or 70 billion now by the time with all the inflation and everything. But the rosiest assumptions at 44 billion with 80% subsidy is a 30% over market value for you can't make it happen. And this is what you and I have been going on about for months. Finally, I noticed this Hillcorp article that was talking about Hillcorp. They finally quote Kathy Tilton at the end. It says, well, of course, Alaskans would prefer to drill their own gas, but the only solution is him. I mean, we've been talking about this for months, that this is the only solution. Why is it that we're the only ones that they finally came around to our point of view because of time, essentially, at this point?
Well, Michael, it's because we run spreadsheets. It's because we actually take the numbers and calculate the market effects. I mean, a lot of the legislature certainly runs, as you have correctly pointed out time and time again, on emotion. The emotion of, it's got to be Alaska gas. It's got to be,
right.
But when you put it in spreadsheets, as I do often, when you put it in spreadsheets, it just doesn't calculate. And the same thing's now true of the big line. It just doesn't calculate.
Right.
If it did, it would have been built already. If it did, we would have more people than just Glenfarne, a small cap, inexperienced operator trying to hit it big. We'd have more than Glenfarne trying to pursue this project.
What do you think?
But it just doesn't.
What do you think the possibility is that this actually becomes a national security, a national strategic asset issue, where they actually will break off some money? I mean, do you think it's going to happen, or does this new Chugach Hillcorp harvest thing, does that submarine it? I mean, what do you think? Are they hell bent for leather to get it done, or what's your take on this?
No, Chugach Hillcorp, even the NSTAR deal does not affect the big line. Does not affect the international nature of the big line. I mean, the in-state demand is minuscule compared to the size of that line and compared to what they need to make it work. Does the nationalization of it does that work? With Trump, you never know. I mean, tomorrow Trump may wake up and say, yes, it's important that we have this tie to Japan. It's important that we have this tie to Korea. I mean, who knows what Kim Jong, whichever one it is, in North Korea is going to do tomorrow, and perturb Trump, and his response would be X. I mean, but that's the case they're making for it. That's the case Dan Sullivan's been making for it. That's the case that Trump himself made for it on Friday. John Sims tried to do that with the whole Cook Inlet incentives deal at one point. He said, well, we got a military base. We got J-Bear. We don't want it dependent on imported gas. And he tried to turn that into a national issue. And the response was, okay, if it's a national issue, if it's a national security issue, if it's important that J-Bear have Alaska gas, then J-Bear can pay for it.
Right.
And that sort of died out fairly quickly.
Right.
So,
Well,
maybe if we say the federal government can pay for the big line, maybe that'll die out fairly quickly.
Well, and still no talk of maybe a Jones Act exemption, a little bit of money to dredge out up north to do tankers, or I mean, there could be other solutions, but here we are. Here we sit, wondering where it's going to happen. But at least we're further ahead this week than we were last week. Like you said earlier, what a difference a week makes. 1 minute.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, Trump's opened, and Dan Sullivan had been trying to kick that door open about the national security issue. This all is justified by national security, but Trump just blew it open, as Trump does when he gets into an area. He just blew it open on Friday, and so okay, let me think about this as a national security issue. And the first thing that came to my mind, seriously, shows you how bizarre, how twisted I am. First thing that came to my mind as I was reading the article is, okay, big inch and little inch. We've done this before.
Right.
We that's how part of the pipeline, the Southwest East Coast pipeline industry got started. We've done this before. So let's do it again. I mean, if that's what we're talking about, it's a strategic issue, then the federal government ought to step in and do it.
Well, I won't hold my breath, but I will be watching with interest at this point to see where things are going. I don't think a lot of people really understand, and I've come to understand more about Trump here in the last 3 or 4 weeks than I ever have before, and realizing that this guy is transactional. Dan Bongino has been talking about him being a transactional president. And in a lot of ways, that's true. I didn't think about him as the businessman who comes in as a negotiator, because he's one of the best negotiators out there. You can love him or hate him. But what he does is he walks into a room and he stakes out a position way over here. He only really wants to get about halfway there, but he stakes out a position way over here. And so everybody loses their mind and they're like, oh, it's a shock and awe value, right? That's what he does with each and every one of these things. And you saw, again, not a fan of tariffs here, but he's utilized tariffs as a bludgeon. Look what he did with Mexico. Look what he did with Canada. Oh, you don't like it? Well, we'll just put tariffs on everything. And they immediately, well, here, what would you like us to do? We'll stop immediately. We'll do, And so it's a genius maneuver. It really is. He walks into a room and says, this is what I want. And he's really happy to get half that, if that, from time to time. But that's what he's doing here. I just hope that maybe, an Alaska LNG line as a national security issue, maybe he's serious about it. I don't know, but we'll be watching closely, I guess.
Well, I think it may have merit. As a national security issue, it may have merit, but as a national security issue, it shouldn't be Alaska's burden. Just like the Coast Guard cutters, just like the Coast Guard, the presence of the Coast Guard, just like the presence of the planes up at Eielson and the troops at at Wainwright. It shouldn't be an Alaska burden. It should be a national burden. If that's the justification for it, it should be a national burden. And rather than going to, AGDC, rather than going and making all these presentations to the legislature, as if it's a commercial project, it's just a waste of time. They ought to be going to Dan Sullivan. Dan Sullivan ought to be setting up hearings before the Armed Services Committee or before other committees in DC to have AGDC make the presentation that it's a national security asset.
But that does raise other issues, though, right? Because now you have an equity and fairness issue with other gas patches and things like that around the country who are saying, well, wait, where's the federal government to build out our infrastructure at the same time?
Absolutely right. And we've already seen a lot of that pushback. But Trump says, and there's some merit for this, Trump says the Alaska project is the only American West Coast project. There isn't a project, will never be a project in Washington, Oregon, or California, because the way those states view this sort of infrastructure or that sort of continuation of the gas economy. The only place it's ever going to happen is in Alaska. And Trump's made a big deal. I mean, link this back in. Trump's made a big deal about the Panama Canal and how strategic the Panama Canal is, and how important it is that America. Well, this is, the only way you get there from the Gulf Coast. Economically from the Gulf Coast LNG plants is through the Panama Canal. So Alaska is different. When you view it through a national strategic asset lens, Alaska is in fact different because it's on the West Coast and it's got those advantages in terms of time and linkage to Japan and Korea. So you blow back and you say, look, I mean, there was the same complaint during World War II. The shipping industry and some smaller ways of getting oil from the Southwest to the East Coast blew back in World War II and said, wait, you shouldn't be building these pipelines. We got ways to do this. You're taking away our customers. And the nation said, nope, it's in the national interest to build these pipelines. So there is a uniqueness to Alaska. It's just not commercial though. I mean, we can't make money off of this. So given all the other demands on our money, we should not be spending money on it.
Well, and the big question, of course, is, and Frank asked it, is who pays? Well, that would be you and me, baby. The whole country will pay. Although somebody else pointed out that there's still $600 billion. Who pointed that? Chris. There's $600 billion left in the Infrastructure Act. There you go. Take 10% of that, fix it, get it done. I mean, the greenies would probably roll over, but I mean, well, or just let Elon Musk and Doge continue to go through USAID and everything else and look through. They'll find that $70 billion to do the pipeline here pretty quick if they need. But I mean, again, if I was going to complain about anything that the federal government was going to do, building infrastructure would be the last thing that I would complain about. Maybe I complain about the cost or the overrun or the inefficiency, but at that point, if they were going to build on something that was at least infrastructure, roads, bridges, dams, pipelines, I mean, that would probably be the last thing that I would complain about at that point. Final thought, Brad, 30 seconds.
Well, and Trump's talked about sovereign wealth fund. This would be a hell of a lot better asset to have in the U.S. sovereign wealth fund than TikTok. It'd be much more useful to the nation.
All right, Brad Keithley and the weekly top three continues. On to number three. We're going to finish up here. The story of the missing paragraph. This sounds like an Encyclopedia Brown mystery, but here we go. Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys. What is the missing paragraph? What are we talking about here, Brad?
Well, it doesn't really go down that track, but it's a good track to go down.
I just loved the title, so I'm running with it. Go ahead.
So part of my career as a lawyer, I had to deal with SEC issues, the Securities and Exchange Commission issues. It was related to oil and gas disclosures and related to what oil and gas companies had to say in their SEC disclosures. But part of my career was focused on SEC and what SEC rules say. And all the SEC really does is require you to disclose information. All the SEC Act and the SEC regulatory agency really do is require you to disclose information. And then they leave it to investors to evaluate that information. If the disclosure is this project may never happen, you may never get your money back, the SEC is satisfied. It's up to investors to decide whether they want to go down that road. And it's really an information disclosure obligation that the SEC has. In Alaska, what I'm beginning to think that we need, when I see headlines, this was generated this week by headlines that an opinion piece in the ADN that says why Alaska must invest in public education now. And then another one that says Alaska contractors warn of alarming outlook for 2025 road construction season. And there's quotes in there about that they need $300 million or something out of the legislature to get them through this coming construction season. Or in the Alaska Beacon, University of Alaska president highlights impact on workforce research and economy and address. But Pat Pitney says the university is facing headwinds from federal executive orders and potential budget cuts. It's just headline after headline after headline of we need more money and we need it from the legislature. And here's the missing paragraph. I mean, if I'm thinking about this in SEC terms and I'm sitting there as a legislator, I would say when you come to make a presentation to me, or when you write an op-ed that you're hoping would influence me, you need to include a paragraph. And the paragraph needs to say two things. It needs to say how you propose to pay for it. 3 things: how you propose to pay for it, whatever you're asking, who pays for it, and whether you're willing to be one of those people paying for it. The thing that really triggered this was this opinion piece by a bunch of people, including Jake Metcalf, who's former head of one of the public employees union, that was titled "Why Alaska Must Invest in Public Education Now." It's this long piece about how important public education is, how the state needs to be funding public education, this additional, the additional funding that's absolutely crucial to make sure that our kids are looked after. And you get all the way to the bottom, and there's nothing in there about either A, how are you going to pay for it? B, who pays for it under this proposed, under your how are you going to pay for it approach? And C, whether you're willing to pay your proportionate part of the cost. It's just all of these are, we need more spending, but I don't know how to pay for it. We need more spending. I assume it's going to come from PFD cuts. And guess what? I don't have to pay, since I'm in the top 20%. All of these people who are writing these articles are in the top 20%. I'm in the top 20%. I get to escape if we push it off on PFD cuts. I want a paragraph that requires people to explain how they're going to pay for it. I think it would be useful. Just like SEC disclosures are useful in telling investors what's the motivation, what's the commercial outlook for this project, what's the impacts of this project. I think it would be useful to have a required disclosure in legislative presentations and in op-eds and designed to influence legislators that says, how are you going to pay for this project? How are you going to pay for this spending? And are you willing to pay your proportionate part of the costs of that spending? And I bet we wouldn't see as many presentations if we had that required disclosure. Just like the SEC disclosure rules, frankly, push a bunch of projects out because people don't want to make those disclosures. They know if they make those disclosures, nobody's going to invest in them. So they just end up not making those proposals. Just like the SEC rules protect against these fly-by-night operations, that sort of disclosure rule in front of the legislature, I think, would protect against a lot of these people coming up and asking for money. Or if they did, at least you'd have them on the record saying, yes, you're either A, you want somebody else to pay for it, go away, or B, okay, you're ready to pay your proportionate part of it. Great. Let's get you on the record. Saying that, how you're going to pay for it, and that you're willing to pay your proportionate part of it. These just, throw it into the air. I want more money. I want more money for K through 12. I want more money for construction. I want more money for the university. Just throw it into the air stuff. That's just, it's not working for me. It's not, and it shouldn't be working for the legislature. They should have these people stand up and say, and yes, this is how I'm going to pay for it. And yes, I'm willing to pay my proportionate part of that.
Well, and of course, the problem is you've got a public that is woefully educated on how the process works. And so all you see, and I was going to do a show on this and I decided not to, but I had half a dozen different Facebook posts from these different local groups, community groups, where people were just, we need to fund education more. We need to keep our schools open. We need to do this. And nobody is asking. Or if somebody does ask, they get shouted down. How do we pay for it? The state is out of money. The state is broke. There's nothing left. They'd have to take the entire PFD, and nobody's mentioning that because of the illiteracy of the public on how the process works. I'm not criticizing them. I'm just saying they're not taking the time to understand how the process works. They don't understand. We have a declining enrollment. That's the biggest problem, is that there's fewer students, fewer butts in the seats. So that's why they're getting paid so much less. And the COVID money, which they used inappropriately. And now all of those chickens are coming home to roost, but nobody understands that. And so the discussion is not even being had. It is, we need to fully fund education. We've been fully funding education.
But the discussion's not being had. I mean, we have this conversation occasionally, and I think it's a useful one. The discussion's not being had because people aren't being forced to confront who pays for it. They aren't being forced to confront that it's middle and lower income Alaska families that are paying for this stuff. I mean, the top 20% get away with writing op-eds like this. And when asked who's going to pay for it or how it's going to be paid for, PFD cuts. Well, Charlie, what that means is you're not paying for it. You're pushing the costs off on the very people you're claiming to help. You're pushing the costs on middle and lower income Alaska families. And they're getting away with doing that because they don't have to confront who pays for it. They don't have to confront, how it's going to be paid. They just assume this money comes off the trees. I mean, I have these discussions occasionally on Facebook or Twitter or in personal discussions about, somebody says, well, we just got to increase K through 12. And I say, okay, well, how are you going to pay for it? Well, I'm willing to give up a piece of my PFD. And my response is, how much of a piece of your PFD is of your income? It's like 0.00001%.
Right.
But you know how much it is to a middle income family? You know how much it is to a low income family?
Yeah.
And they say, well, we'll address that other ways. We'll deal with that. We'll deal with that other way.
It's all proportionality.
No, right now. Let's deal with it through an income tax. You want to pay for it, or you want to do this, then you have to pay a proportionate part of it. And let's do it through. Oh no, we can't do that. We can't do it through an income tax.
Well, it's all about proportionality at that point. What is the cost to you as a proportion of your entire income versus, what is it to somebody else? But I mean, that's the thing that just blows me away is people are just like, oh, just fund it. Just fund it. The well is dry. There is not much left. And when if you did try to fund it and drain the PFD down to zero, what happens next? And nobody's asking those questions. I mean, there are a few legislators that bring it up, but for the most part, nobody's asking those questions, and they are the loudest voices out there right now.
Those legislators are the ones, or the ones that are staying quiet, are the ones that are pushing for this combination of the corpus and the earnings reserve, so they can start going into the corpus to pay for it.
Final thoughts, Brad.
Final thoughts is it's a little bit sunnier this week. Cook Inlet's on an upswing. We've got good news on Cook Inlet in the form of Hillcorp or in the form of the Kenai LNG plant and in the form of Chugach's step. And we still got other issues.
That's the thing, Brad. I mean, I literally was pulling through these groups in the Mat-Su, in Fairbanks, in Homer, in the, down on the peninsula. And everybody's like, don't close my schools, just fully fund it. The legislature should just do their job and they should just fully fund. They are fully funding it. They're funding it according to the formula, and they're giving money on top of it and have been. But the biggest problem here that nobody's talking about is the declining enrollment, 15% in Fairbanks. Their enrollment dropped in 1 year, 15%. And they're not talking about that. And they're not talking about the continued projected decline, that it's just going to get worse. These school districts have been running deficits for years. And the answer is just ask Uncle Sugar for more money. Uncle Sugar is broke. There is no more money. But nobody seems to acknowledge that. It's just always, just pull. We're so disconnected from how this whole thing works. It's just amazing.
We are. I've been reminded of that. I've been visiting my mother in Illinois a lot, and I've reconnected with some of the people I grew up with, and I've been reminded of how local schools are in Illinois because they're funded largely through local school districts and taxes on local school districts. The state funds a portion of it, makes some contribution to it, but the primary funder is the local school district. And so in Illinois, people are very, this isn't true in Illinois about everything, but in Illinois, people are very focused on being cost conscious about school districts, making sure school districts are at the lowest cost. And, in my local area where I grew up, very rural part of Illinois, there's pushes to consolidate because they recognize that the tax base that's there just can't support, the smaller school districts that we used to have. And so we have, we have school districts that are much bigger now. It's because we had school closures and school districts are much bigger. It's because it's locally funded. It's because people have to confront the funding themselves. It's because they have to pay. And so they get involved in
they're invested in
keeping the cost.
Yeah, they're invested in it. And we here, we're just, I mean, again, look at the comments. I was going to just read the comments for an hour because people obviously don't understand what's going on in the state. And our legislators are not doing anybody favors by continuing to lie. Gary Stevens got caught in the whole lie of the 40 students per classroom thing and everything else. And it doesn't matter to them. They just want to protect what they need to protect, and they'll do whatever. But the people don't understand. And that's the problem. If the people truly understood what was happening with this, they would be up in arms about it. They would be up in arms about the way the spending is going, but they're totally disconnected because it comes from a permanent fund and they never see it.
I think part of the solution to K through 12, I think part of the solution to education is increase local funding, increase required minimum funding, and however that affects maximum funding, but increase local funding so that people, like in Illinois, people become more connected to the spending. People realize more the level at which the spending is occurring and the impact, and because it impacts them. I think Alaska has become too remote in that sense. It's somebody else's responsibility. I mean, this was the whole problem with building new school buildings, right? I mean, let's build a new school building. Oh, that's a great idea. The state will fund 90% of it. Let's add this gizmo and that gizmo to the new school building because the state's going to pay 90% of it. I think part of the solution, frankly, is to localize the funding more. And the way we would do that in Alaska is increase the required local contribution. And then we'd see all sorts of things. Then we'd see people in Fairbanks going, "Oh, we need to consolidate these schools."
Yeah, let's find some cost savings. Because I think there's only one or two districts in the whole state that are anywhere near the local cap. I know Juneau is, and I think, but Fairbanks and I think both Fairbanks and Matsu have got a pretty good sized chunk that they could go to if they really wanted to do it. But then people would be like, "Wait, you mean we have to pay?" Yes, that's how it works. You have to pay. If you want a chicken in every pot and you want every school to remain open, there's a cost to that. So yeah.
And that's sort of what I mean by the missing paragraph. Let's put in the payment, what payment you're proposing, and let's localize it in terms of you have to pay. Are you willing to step up and pay your proportionate part? And the answers are going to be different than what we're getting now when somebody else has to pay. Yes, I want you to spend more money on this because I don't have to pay for it. Everybody else has to pay for it.
And it's so infuriating to see them buy into the narrative. Well, that you flat funded education. No, they haven't. The BSA, the base formula has been fairly flat, but they've been spending hundreds of millions of dollars every year on top of that. You just seem like you forgot about that. No, they intentionally have been misled by legislators, the NEA, the education complex. I mean, that's who they've been misled by. And they're just parroting the talking points instead of looking at it. And they don't understand. That's the bottom line. I read all these comments and I realize none of these people understand how this process works.
Yep. And it's because of the remoteness, Michael. I mean, it's because the dollars are remote from them. They don't have to pay them.
Yep.
And, for the top 20%, they, even when they do pay them, it's a very, 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 very small part of their income. And so it's just, it's sort of like someone criticized me for the second segment about let the federal government fund the pipeline. I mean, the criticism is, well, you don't have to pay for it then. I mean, you're trying to shove the costs on somebody else. But that's what we have. That's what we have a lot in this state. We have people saying, I need more for education. I need more for construction. I need more for the university. Somebody else pay for it.
Right. No, it's insane. All right, Brad. Thank you so much. You ray of sunshine, thank you for coming on board, and we'll talk to you next week. Okay.
Michael, good to see you. Well, that's a wrap for another week's edition of the weekly top 3 from Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets. Thank you again for joining us. Remember that you can find past episodes on our YouTube, SoundCloud, Spotify, and Substack pages, and keep track of us during the week on Facebook and Twitter. This has been Brad Keithley, Managing Director of Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets. We look forward to you joining us again next week for the next edition of the Weekly Top 3.